In sections 2 and 3, we shifted from our study of circumcision and began to dig into the socio-religious background of Paul's famous phrase, works of the law. And what we learned, especially from Qumran's 4 QMMT document, as well as from the surviving rabbinic literature, is that works of law is not merely a description of works, that is, say, self-effort, like a Jewish person who's trying to just do the Torah. That's not really what works of the law is, even though that's the way it is popularly taught in today's Christian circles. That's not really the way it was taught or encountered in first century. I go on to say what Shaul is really talking about when he employs the Greek phrase ergo nomou, translated as deeds/works of the law, is in actuality a technical phrase that the Judaisms of Shaul's day employed to speak of the social, religious, and ethnic boundary markers that separated Jews from Gentiles and which undergirded covenant membership in group sectarianism. So right away, it's not merely a simple doing of the Torah. It's rather a policy that was enforced in the first century Judaisms, and it turned into a kind of a rite of passage among Gentiles and Jews, particularly for Jews wanting to gain Gentiles wanted to gain Jewish status within the Jewish communities. So that's what I mean by sectarianism and covenant membership and things like that. I go on to say, indeed, the prevailing view of the sages of the first century, as far as we can tell from the surviving oral writings, the teachings that turned into the Mishnah and the Talmud. So they were circulating in the first century as oral statements, oral teachings that were memorized and passed on from sage to student, et cetera, and then eventually they were codified and written down and turned into the written versions that we know as Mishnah, Talmud, Mishnah, Gemara equals Talmud today. So if we can glean our understanding of the first century Judaisms from what we read in the Talmud today, the Mishnah and the Gemara, then this is the perspective. There's other rabbinic writings that factor into this, the 4 QMMT writings at Qumran and things like that. But overall, here's what we end up with. The first century held to the common belief that Jewish Israel and Jewish Israel alone shared a place in the world to come. And we have a quote from the Mishnah Tractate Sanhedrin 10:1, which references Isaiah 60, verse 21. Thus, I say, in their way of thinking, if a non-Jew wished to enter into Hashem's covenant blessings and promises, such a person had to convert to Judaism first, that is to say, take on legal Jewish status, which granted covenant membership, and then they exercised maintenance of existing covenant membership by ongoing loyalty and obedience to the Torah. So are you understanding there's 2 steps in the conversion process? The first step was to convert to Judaism, or to change your ethnicity by going through, I think it was like something like 3 or 4 steps that involved circumcision for males, bringing a sacrifice because the temple was still standing, paying a certain amount of tax, and then committing yourself to kind of a smaller listing of Torah commands. Those were some of the, I'm sorry, of course there was the ablution, what we today call baptism in a mikveh tank. Okay, so those are some of the steps that involved your conversion from Gentile to Jewish status. And then after you made your conversion and publicly declared yourself to be a Jewish person, you were then obligating yourself to take on the rest of Torah obligation for the rest of your life as a maintenance exercise. In other words, you were brought into this membership, this group club, by your conversion, but then you had to maintain your membership position by steering clear of idolatry, by keeping the commandments of God, by being a good, upstanding Jewish citizen in Israel, things like that. So it was this kind of 2-step process of getting in and staying in. That was, and I think that terminology is borrowed from either E.P. Sanders or James D.G. Dunn. I think it's Sanders, the getting in, staying in concept in the first century. You got into Israel by your ethnic change from Gentile to Jew, and you stayed in Israel by keeping Torah and steering clear of idolatry and staying loyal to God. So those were the two steps. I go on to say in my commentary, to be sure, this is also one of the primary arguments delineated in the letter to Galatians, all right? This idea of works of the law, this program of how do we become covenant members. Now, of course, today, we don't use that language of how do we become covenant members. We simply, in Christian circles, we parse it as how do we become saved. Because in the first century, the word saved was a buzzword for covenant membership or becoming righteous or being counted as righteous before God. So it's an overlapping concept. Saved in Christian circles in the first century would have been equated with covenant membership or be counted as righteous from a Jewish perspective. They didn't really wield the word saved there like in a personal salvation sense so as much as Christians do today. They really practice more of what we would recognize as a corporate salvation, a group salvation, a salvation for all Israel. That's the way they kind of viewed it. And as long as you belonged to the people group of Israel, then you were in. You didn't have to worry about personal salvation. You just simply had to worry about group membership and identification within the larger group, covenant membership within the larger group known as Covenant Israel. And as long as you were in the group, then you were saved. I'm using air quotes with my fingers for those of you who can't see me right now. All right, so this was the program that Paul had to wrestle with. Was this the right way to understand God's covenants? Was this the right way to be counted as righteous, i.e. saved? Where does Jesus fit into the whole picture if one can gain their covenant membership by being born Jewish or converting, and if one can maintain their covenant membership by simply keeping the commandments? Where does Yeshua's sacrifice fit into all that, and why is it even needed? Aha, this is why Paul spotted a problem after he became a Messianic Jew.